Yo, what's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Mindshack. This is episode 4. My name is Jean-Claude. I am from South Africa and the host of this podcast. I am joined by
Christina. I'm from Kenya and I'm also a host for this episode.
All right. Mindshack is an African podcast focusing on leadership, society issues, and psychology from Africans who I can honestly, humbly say we aim to be African leaders across the continent through doing hard things. So I thank you for tuning in today. This episode has got something of a speciality to it. We've decided for the first time to bring on 2 new guests. I won't go into too much about who they are. I think they can do that themselves. But firstly, in alphabetical order, of course, I'm going to go with Bezawit. Bezawit, please explain a little about yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Beza. I am from Ethiopia and I am a social science student.
Awesome. Koki?
My name is Koki. I study sociology and social policy and I'm from Kenya.
Awesome. I think the little description of who these people are kind of helps a little in what our thinking was in bringing on guests. Koki studies social science and this episode is on social movements in Africa. Bezawit is also someone that's just within our schooling system and highly passionate about social issues, psychology, things of that nature that are happening in society. So we thought there would be 2 guests that will really edify the episode. And I'm happy you guys are here. How are you guys feeling today? You can start, Beza.
I'm very excited for this discussion. I feel like our topic is something that I'm very passionate about and it's very relevant in today's world. So I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's perspectives. And yeah, I'm just excited.
Awesome. And yourself, Koki?
I think I'm with Beza. I'm also very excited to be a part of this conversation, especially since I think it's very relevant in today's society.
Christina, don't worry, I still love and care about you. Tell me how you feel.
I think they've definitely covered it. It's very, very relevant, today's topic. And I think even just from the little research that I've done, it is quite an interesting one. So I'm excited to see what, comes to light and what we end up sharing and talking about.
Okay. So in light of that, Christina, I'm going to throw it back at you. What is a social movement about?
So my understanding or the definition that I found is that it's a loosely organized effort by a large group of people to achieve a particular goal, usually like a social or political one, like advocating for some type of social change. It's important to note that there's a difference between a social movement and social change. There's actually a relationship with them. A social movement is the effort to create social change.
I think that sums it up. I mean, in my understanding, social movements can be done in different ways too. So to our guests, we spoke about it a little bit before the episode started, and I'm curious for you to speak on it. Beza, you mentioned, I'm putting you on the spot, that you had a few things to mention. Have you been in a protest before? What are your thoughts of being in a protest?
No, I haven't been in a protest before. I've always wanted to participate in social movements, but I guess I haven't really had the chance to do so far. I think one of the primary reasons is probably the political climate of the country that I live in, Ethiopia, is not necessarily the best place to participate in social movements for. It's very common for protests or any type of demonstration to get very, very, very violent. I mean, I have many memories of political protests or any social movements interfering with various parts of my life. I mean, the most recent one being right before I left for college, there were protests that were taking place right outside our house. And so sitting down in our living room watching TV of the protests, we could actually smell the tear gas. And at one point it got so bad, we had to go wash our faces, Google what they need to do in cases of, tear gas poisoning. And so I feel like it's been something that's been so close to me, and yet I've never actually been a part of it. So I feel like I have a very interesting perspective in terms of I have a sense of objectivity because of my lack of direct involvement, but it's also something that's been very close to me in terms of the causes, but also the actual movements. And so, yeah.
That's such an interesting way you put it.
Yeah.
Been in it. That's so unfortunate, first of all, but maybe it was God telling you that you should have been part of the protest.
Literally bringing it to you.
I think that part of the issue is that for some social movements, it's easier to find your position more so than others. I think when it is, something like the Black Lives Matter protests that take place in the US, I definitely know my stance, right? As opposed to protests that take place in the country that are usually regarding, political reform or, ethnic sides. And whenever ethnic issues get involved, it can be very hard to gain perspective and to see where people are being negatively led by their biases or their tribalism, and what issues are actually things that I actually align with my values and beliefs. And so, yeah, it's just it can be very difficult for me to know where to position myself in these conflicts. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a real thing, and I think it's a thought that we all have. What is our take, and how can we align with the goal and objectives, and potentially make an impact ourselves? Koki, to you, I don't think I want to ask the same question. For now, I think one thing that's coming to mind is us talking about what is actually happening right now, and that is the Black Lives Matter movement. And that is a big thing, and there's a lot to talk about there. Koki, I brought your name up. I'm not gonna absolutely throw on you what your thoughts are for you to take on that whole thing, but I would love for you to share at least a little of like where you feel you might sit in the whole story. If you have in any way, maybe through social media, played a part in it, how have you and why have you?
Firstly, my stance is that I support the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's important to end the systemic racism against Black people, and it's an important conversation to have. I think it's a bit, I wouldn't say it's a late, but it's concerning that we're having this conversation in 2020 and that there's still these injustices going on now. The ways I've helped, I think, obviously I'm not in the US, I can't really help, but I have signed petitions and, shared information with relevant people to just have a conversation about what's going on. And yeah, I think that's the small part I've played in it, just having conversations with people about what's going on, and also signing petitions and sharing them so that, if that can make a change, like I can be a part of it.
I actually have a question, including JC. When this Black Lives Matter thing started to, really take a hold of social media, did you guys feel some type of pressure to follow the movement, or did you just naturally support it?
I felt pressure. I'm not so often on social media. Social media isn't necessarily my thing. Obviously, this was a protest. These were protests that I'm particularly talking of the George Floyd Black Lives Matter movement in America.
Yeah.
It wasn't happening in my community, of course. And my community was through social media playing their part. I felt pressure in some way to play my part. However, I do feel I've also played my part in some way, similar to what Koki said, because at the end of the day, there's no measure of what your part is. I don't believe there's a measure. That's at least my opinion. And so I played a part in some way of getting awareness out to people that might not know and understand what the movements are about, as well as sharing and signing petitions. In my South African community and context, there's a Collins Khoza that was brutally basically beat up and killed, and the protests that have happened, but it doesn't get the amount of rap and like awareness, obviously, protests in America. So like there's all protests that happened, which I would have loved to join, but literally didn't hear about it until the following week after it happened. So there's also that in Africa where we might be in a place where we are almost trying to say figuring out the balance of protesting effectively. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I think, JC, you actually touched on something very important when you created that difference between the effect that, protests have in Africa and in America. And I'd love for us to get back there, but I definitely want to hear about Beza's opinion about, did you feel any pressure to support the Black Lives Matter movement?
Every day or two, but I'm not necessarily the person who posts a lot. And so, and I think fortunately for me, I was having this conversation with a very close friend of mine, and they are also similarly someone who really doesn't use social media very much. And they felt as though there was a lot of inauthenticity in the way that people felt the need to participate in this, although they very often, kept silent on very important issues, or in the moments that mattered, whenever someone made a disparaging remark in real life, or you just could see that their sentiments didn't necessarily align with the Black Lives Matter movement or what it stood for. And so I think I did feel the pressure, I will say this, I did feel the pressure, but I tried to choose to only stick to things that I felt were important. So I tried to, tweet and retweet information that I felt people that I felt could reach people and it could actually make change, try to focus on, petitions or vital information for, any mutuals that may have been attending the protests, especially also giving historical context for a lot of things, because I do believe history matters a lot, and I'm not sure how aware we are of things. So I just felt like trying to communicate knowledge as much as possible was the way to go. I will say this, I remember opening my Instagram app one day and scrolling through and through and through, and every single post was a Black square. And at that point, I wasn't sure how to react necessarily. It was nice to see the solidarity, but aside from that, I wasn't sure what impact it would have. And so I was trying to do some research, and I came across a few people who were talking about how difficult it was to find very important information through the Black Lives Matter hashtag because of because of how much people were using it to just post Black cubes out of just not knowing, not out of any ill intention. And so I was thinking about what the magnitude of impact it would be, and also what the intention would be behind me just posting a Black cube. I felt like I would just be doing it to fit in with the masses. I didn't feel like it would be something I would do very authentically, because I've never posted on Instagram. And so I think this would have just been something I would have done for show. So instead I thought, maybe let me just try to help out with trying to get people to remove the Black Lives Matter hashtag. So me and a couple of friends spent the day. I mean, luckily I didn't have a lot of work that day. And so we spent the afternoon just sort of getting more people to just literally search the Black Lives Matter hashtag and then comment on people's posts saying, please remove this hashtag so that people can find very vital information. And it felt like a very futile thing to do, but it was a lot of us. And, eventually people removed it, and, just it became more functional on the app again. And so it just felt to me like that was more of an authentic thing for me to do. So I think I did feel the need to participate, but I'm not sure how much I went with that need. I mean, at the end of the day, I felt like if it's not authentic, I'd rather just be as practically helpful to the movement as I can be, as opposed to just doing things so that I don't feel left out, or so that I feel as though I am, demonstrating how much of a proponent I am of the movement, because I am, and I do believe in it, but I think I chose to kind of focus on the more practically useful actions I could take.
First of all, that is so dope. I know it sounds like a small thing, but Bez, that is very, very useful. And I'm glad there are people like you in this world. But I think I'd love to end this, this one conversation with Koki's opinion. What do you think about the inauthenticity of how, the Black Lives Matter movement has been happening on social media? Did you feel any pressure?
I for sure felt pressure. I think there was a lot of quotes going around, if you're choosing to stay silent, you're choosing the side of the oppressor, and you're exercising your privilege if you choose to stay quiet in a situation like this. But on the other hand, I mean, the pressure can be overwhelming for people. Like Beza said, when I opened my Instagram and I saw the Black squares, I was like, damn, everyone's doing this. So should I do it as well? Am I a bad person for not posting a Black square? But on the other hand, I think applying this pressure has forced conversation, especially with big brands and stuff, about their diversity, their inclusivity, the way they, their Black employees the way they deal with Black people. So that pressure has allowed for these conversations to happen, because Black Lives Matter has been around for a while. Like, we've known it's been there. But in this situation, a lot of pressure has been applied that I think this pressure might actually be a good tool to create that change.
Yeah, Koki, I think, like, for me, right, with you being on, one of the big things is I want to tap into your, like, mind, right, based on what you study, your experience, etc. So help me help you help us, if you get what I mean. So what would you have done differently in this Black Lives Matter protest?
You know, to be honest, I don't think I would have done anything differently. I know there's a lot of like negativity that was surrounding the protest, because there was like looting and stuff like that that sort of distracted from the main message, and some of the protest turns into like riots. But the thing is, like I said, applying this pressure allows for this change to happen. If you look at history, okay, I'd just like to like cite from Kenya's own history. We had freedom fighters, they're called Mau Mau, and they fought for, you know, our independence against the British. And it wasn't, you know, riots, it wasn't protests, it wasn't taking the streets. They actually had to like, you know, it was guerrilla warfare. Like, they had to take this stuff like and use guns and other weapons to actually fight for independence. So I'd say fighting for social change is not always black and white. Like, you can say protests and signing petitions and whatever, but if we look at history, this simply is not enough. I'm not saying that, like, you know, inciting all this like pandemonium and everything everywhere is a good thing, but it's not, especially when your voice is being subdued and people won't hear. Sometimes you have to take things a notch higher in order to be heard. And so I don't think I'd do anything different. That might be controversial, but yeah, that's my view. I think to create social change, there needs to be an aspect of that included. Yeah. It's not necessarily right, I'd say, but it's just the system we live in, I think, that forces you to go a step further, because just simply taking the streets and protesting, peaceful protests, sometimes it's not taken as seriously.
Well, that's quite interesting, because some research I've done into the topic has kind of alluded to people basically believe their appeals to authorities won't be heard. So essentially, things get more violent when people feel like they're not going to be heard, and or the leaders take a heavy-handed approach to controlling the protests. Why it's interesting is that historically, the peaceful protests seem to be the protests that have done the most social change to some level. And violent protests, so I'm playing a little bit of a devil's advocate, have not always brought about the change that people particularly want. The better approaches have been a strategic, peaceful approach that tackles some of the policies or structures that are put in place causing the social issue. So in that kind of regard, do you still stand in the same place?
I'm all for peaceful protests and all that, and I believe it can bring effective change. But I think sometimes when you're fighting, there's some resistance. And I think in the Black Lives Matter, we've seen that they're not coming to you with peace. I think it's sort of hard to keep your stance on that peaceful protest. I think as humans, especially in a situation that's so angering, to see a video of a man, you know, being kneeled on and he can't breathe and he's crying out to breathe and everything. And this is a long video. It's not just like 2 minutes. It's long. It's like 8-9 minutes of this constantly, and no one's listening. I think a person can get very triggered and angered, especially if they're taking this to the streets peacefully and they're being met with resistance over basic human rights. I think it can get to that point. But as I said, I'm not advocating for violence in these protests. I think sometimes it actually leads to a means to a change, but definitely peaceful protests are the way to go.
Okay, so JC, I mean, I want to say I see your point, but I feel like I've had this discussion so many times that I've kind of had to do a lot more research than, the information that I had. And so I think now my stance is I definitely do not agree with you. So I think this started with, I was very 50-50 on the topic. I wasn't very sure if, peaceful protests were more effective or, but is violence the answer and distracts from the situation? And so I was in a conversation where someone was mentioning how peaceful protests were the reason we had so many, reforms, and a lot of the social change historically has resulted from peaceful reforms. And the other person only asked, okay, give an example. And so this person mentioned, I'm just going to focus on two of the social movements that the person mentioned. The first was India's independence, which will very famously get brought up anytime anyone discusses, peaceful protests or, having a large impact, and Martin Luther King. And so I was doing a lot of research into those two instances of, social political movements. And it was very interesting because I found that while these two movements have been portrayed in a very, very peaceful sense, the reason the movements had a lot of impact is because of the very non-peaceful activities that surrounded them that were not necessarily brought to the forefront as to how these two stories were told. I mean, when we talk about India's independence, it could be easy to talk about the protests, but at the end of the day, the only reason the British at the end of the day heard of the protests were because they were very much threatened by the potential for unrest that was demonstrated, because the Indian there were a lot of underground fighters fighting for the independence of India. And because of the number of people that were involved in that, and because Britain anticipated that they wouldn't be able to overcome the violence if it ever resorted to that, they listened to the peaceful protests. But at the end of the day, there was a lot of violence that surrounded it, a lot of violence that preceded it. And so I think that's something that we tend to overlook. And the same with MLK. At the end of the day, the civil rights movement took a lot more of a violent, I want to say, direction once MLK was assassinated. And so after that, it took a lot of, violence and riots and looting before the voices of the people behind the movements were heard. And so it can be very easy to focus on the peaceful aspects, but at the end of the day, no country has gained their independence, no minority has gained their independence solely, or even if I'm being honest, very few have gained them predominantly from peaceful means. If we talk about the suffragettes, if we talk about, the civil rights movement, any type of Black rights or Black independence movement, if we talk about, any of the anti-colonial struggles in Africa, any of the anti-colonial struggles in South America, all of them required violence, because at the end of the day, when you are the oppressed group, it can be very hard to get your voice or your message across without it. And so I don't know, I think it's very difficult for me to believe that violence isn't the answer. Of course, there's so much other negative consequence that comes with violence. A lot of Black folks with small shops and stores were looted and they lost a lot, and so there were a lot of Black victims from the riots and the protests that took place. I will acknowledge that there's been a lot of loss from the oppressed people's sides throughout any of the instances of violent social movements that I expressed. But at the end of the day, I don't believe the whole narrative of peaceful social movements being more effective.
That's really, really well said, because I spoke of historically, and I might have been speaking of specific scenarios where these sort of protests have done the most impact, and probably the most, I mean, online and socially known protests are the ones that might have taken this approach, and at least what we saw immediately, and that's not the only way it was done. So yeah, that's a real point, and I think I agree with that. One important thing within that too is the fact that it really depends on the social issue that's happening too. And governmental leadership that's running a country just generally oppressing people are something very wrong. Like for instance, the apartheid regime in South Africa, where literally Black people were just being forced to live a different life to white people. And in that case, it took violence and people dying in order for that regime to stop. And that's such an important one, at least in our history. So yeah, I completely hear you. One of the next things that are coming to mind is how online interactions incite the movement, like incite the direction of the movement. From the feel of it, I don't know if it's just me, the feel of the online community, there's a lot of noise in general, a lot of opinions being shared, some good opinions getting washed up in the noise, some good opinions standing out, some crazy people just saying crazy things to directly oppose other people. And yeah, you get to kind of learn how the community stands from just watching what people are saying and what people are speaking about. So yeah, in that regard, we can see kind of movements spreading across countries because of social media. And so I'm trying to get at you here and kind of get an understanding of online interactions and how their effectiveness in creating social change. There are a lot of scenarios where things that are related to businesses and organizational structures through social media have gotten a lot of change affected to them. However, governmental organizational cases might be slightly different, and social media feels it's powerful, but it feels a little like it's more of getting the movement across and not, maybe that gets a change to happen. But I hope it's something along the lines of what your thoughts would be of online social movements, what impact they have and how it's carried along.
I think social media is an important tool in communicating what your social movement is about, what you're aiming to fight for, what are your grievances, what are the changes you're hoping to make. I think social media is very effective in doing that. I think as well as in these, just linking it back to the protests that have been happening in America, I think the media, I'm talking about like news outlets, sometimes they're owned by, big people, and, sometimes they censor stuff. And so social media is essentially somewhat uncensored, and you can see things that the media is not reporting and gain more clarity on, the movement. But I think that's like the extent that social media goes. Like, it can only do so much. It can only communicate, what they want, the social issue, to raise awareness. But if from a sociological perspective, there's like stages to social movements. And the first stage, the preliminary stage, is making people aware of the issue, right? And then when you go past there, it's to, publicize your issue and take to the streets for your protest, your peaceful protest, or whatever, action you're going to take from there. A lot of people will support you online, but on the ground, things are sort of different. Like Beza said, with the protests in her country, she's interested, but it's kind of like a sticky situation to actually go out there and protest. So social media does raise that awareness, but when it comes to doing things on the ground, You need actual people, actual voices there. And some people might be a bit hesitant and scared to, like, in person show up and show out and be about this. I think it's quite easier to be behind a screen, supporting and, learning about it. But social media only does so much. To effectively create social change, you have to go past raising awareness of the issue. Okay, we know what this issue is about. Now, what do we do about it? And now when it comes to what we do about it, I think that's where like supporters start like sort of flaking off and dropping off. It can be useful, but I think you need to go a step further than social media to create social change.
I definitely agree with Koki that social media is very useful in the education of social injustices, but it doesn't necessarily help with the action. So with that being said, I actually want to ask you guys, what do you think are the biggest barriers for social movements, for the effectiveness of social movements in Africa? Like, what do you think is kind of holding back the same effectiveness we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement?
For some issues, it's that you don't necessarily know what centralized group or groups or individuals there are to reach out to kind of find out what steps you can actually take to help out the issue. I say this because I think of like a specific scenario. If we're considering maybe some type of a small, like a more focused issue, right? One time I knew a nearby organization, like a women's rights and women's movement focused organization, was kind of starting this movement around Addis and really rural Ethiopia as well. It was called the Yellow Movement. It is called the Yellow Movement. I think one thing about that was that throughout the movement till today, there has always been an organized central structure where you knew where it was coming from, where you knew where to ask questions if you wanted to aid the organization or aid the movement, where to direct funds if you wanted to contribute, just to gain more historical background on the issue, to ask questions, to meet up. There were always, and still are, people that you can look to get a sense of direction. Because I see a lot of good intention, but I don't think we have a sense of direction in terms of gaining more context, asking the questions that we need to ask. And I don't think social media is necessarily the best place, especially, like I said, I'm more of an avid user of Twitter. I would say it is definitely not a safe space to ask your questions, say on a Twitter platform. Just randomly putting it out there can kind of just get whatever answers the masses are going to give you. And so having that centralized point was very vital for us. And so I think in a lot of social movements, it can be very difficult for you to get a sense of what you can do and how you should do it, and be generally someone that tries to weed out people who are involved for their own personal gain. Say if it is a protest, people who come out just to get riots started and maybe rob a few stores, So like in that sense, I think the fact that for larger social movements, it can be very difficult to organize that, to have a central body, especially for something like Black Lives Matter, where, there were people who initially got the idea for Black Lives Matter and tried to spread out the hashtag, and there were people in different fronts in different places trying to, guide people, try to inform them, trying to keep everyone focused on the issue at hand. But at the end of the day, I think it was too large a movement for people to be able to give that sense of direction. And so everyone was kind of interpreting things the way they felt as though it should be interpreted. And yeah, I think if there was more of a sense of guidance, like if there was more of a sense of direction for some of these movements, I think it would be more effective instead of just people, because there's a lot of small things that we can do that would help movements that we are simply not aware of. And we're just sort of doing things because we see other people do them, I retweet information that people that I follow tweet or retweet, It's not like I really had a specific source that I knew to go to. Of course, now I have kind of had to learn through experience, through trial and error, what things to focus on, what things to listen to, what things not to listen to, where to go to read books that teach me more about the issue and the history of the issue. But it took a lot of trial and error. And fortunately for me, I wasn't as how do I say, I didn't necessarily follow anyone's idea. I sort of took a very observant stance when I was very first introduced to this movement. And so I didn't really know what to focus on. And so I think now I'm very fortunate to know where to go to say websites or petition sites, or what, like even people who I know organize issues that are focused on Black lives, that utilize to the best of my ability the resources that I have. And yeah, I think it's just, like I said, the general lack of direction that comes associated with such large movements.
Oh, okay, I love that. So if I was to try put that into one word, would that be like that, like the lack of unity in a sense, helping everybody reach the same level of understanding? Is that somewhat of what you're saying? Because my understanding of okay, great. I definitely think that's also an issue that I would see with even like protests in Kenya. There's a type of divide between those who understand it and then those who think that it's just like a radical movement. Like, let's say even like the feminist movement, there are a lot of people who aren't willing to help others understand what's going on. Instead, you're labeled as uneducated, you're labeled as still a patriarch, so many things like that, when I think actually it's that nurturing kind of vibe that we need when it comes to these movements, to ensure that everyone is given the same, is given enough attention to understand what's going on. Other than that, this has been a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much, Beza and Koki, for sitting in with me and JC and having this conversation on social movements. It is very relevant, and you really touched on some important things that I think even I personally will go and think about some more and look more into and understand better. So definitely thank you two for coming on here. Does anybody have any final words, concluding remarks about what they think is important about a social movement?
One thing is that in the time that we're in, frustrations are easily gonna brew. We're in a time that's just different. I think, Tina, you in another conversation you mentioned, we're living in a time that's just super different. It's a layered. There's a number of things that are happening that, if more, you see all the memes since 2020 started, they're what else is going to happen in 2020? And so there's a number of things that have happened that are put it in a position where it's a bit sensitive when something else happens, right? So in this case, that's people were in a pandemic, people could not pay their bills, people were already at home frustrated, and something so sad and just not needed happened, of someone getting killed like that. So it's a sensitive time. And that thought on Christina mentioning something offline, she mentioned it, she said it in a way that's interesting. We're living in a moment in history, in a moment in time. It's we're in the middle of a book right now and we don't know it. So it's important to try to think of things in that nature too. I think that's it for me. I'm concluding.
I think just to agree with JC and just say we are living in a time, definitely this is going to go down in history books, and it's something you're probably going to be talking to your kids about, there's this crazy time we're locked in the house, and then suddenly all the things we put on back burners, there's been all these injustices, but I don't think there's been as much time to focus on them as there is now, sort of because there's nothing else to do but to focus on this injustice, on these injustices, and I think the ending, not the ending really, because history really never ends, time goes on, but I think this is one of the things we'll tell our kids, we did this and we changed this, and we, our generation, I have so much hope that we're going to create social change, especially you guys have talked in this podcast about being African leaders and stuff. I think I can clearly see that a lot of us are going to make definite social changes in Africa, for sure.
Wow. I feel like I feel like Koki really said what I was thinking on my mind when she said, like a lot of things that we put on back burners have, I think, like come to the forefront of our lives, whether it be, you know, some more, you know, global movements like Black Lives Matter, or really personal issues, like at the end of the day, because you're stuck in your home with really not much to do. I don't know, I just feel like 2020 has been a year of having to come to terms with a lot of things and having to realize how much work we need to do in our personal lives, but also as people, as humanity, there's a lot we need to change. And I think it's been a time of realizing that.
Great. But yeah, I think for me, just to add on, I'd say, although these are really tough times and we really are in history, I know we always are, but like this is history. Like these are the ones, you know, kids are going to do exams on. But anyway, like living in this history, I do still have faith in our, you know, in our humanity, the fact that there are social movements that are happening, because it's a sign that people are uncomfortable with a lot of social injustices. So that being said, it's uncomfortable, but it's so necessary. And yeah, I'm glad we're all on the same page, that these things are very useful. And yeah, I'm looking forward to see what our generation, what else we're gonna be, you know, uncovering, unmasking, like in Scooby-Doo. But otherwise, guys, thanks for listening to this podcast. I have really enjoyed this conversation. Please do check out our social medias at Mindshack, MIND_SHACK on Instagram. There'll be a link there where you can just see the rest of our, you know, our episodes. But otherwise, just keep up to date with our Instagram to just get any posts about what we're up to or any Q&As you may be having, because we'd love to have your input in our episodes. Otherwise, thank you and goodbye.
Cheers.